together two strategic minds, not in person, but through carefully constructed avatars that represent their ideas. On one side, a political and psychological interpretation of the war. On the other, a military and strategic analysis grounded in battlefield reality. The question is simple, but the answer may define the future. Is Ukraine under pressure to accept a false peace? While Russia prepares for a longer war, let's begin. Gentlemen, welcome. We have endured almost 4 years of a devastating war. The front lines barely move, but the human cost is catastrophic. General Ryan, you have supported the Ukrainian government's strategy of inflicting massive attrition on Russia. Alex, you have been highly critical of this vision. Let's start there. What is the current reality on the battlefield?
The reality is that Russia has abandoned any pretense of military efficiency in favor of pure attrition, suffering catastrophic casualties for glacial advances. For Ukraine to survive, it must change this equation. I support the goal set by the Ukrainian leadership to kill 50,000 Russians a month. Ukraine is demonstrating impressive tactical excellence with its deep asymmetric strikes, destroying Russian refineries and vital microchip factories like Kremny L. This massive attrition is the only way to alter Putin's strategic calculus.
With all due respect, Mick, that logic of killing 50,000 Russians is a public relation disaster and proof of military incompetence. How can you report to 820,000 targets hit if the Russian army on our territory is 700,000? The goal of the war is not to accumulate points or e-balls by destroying isolated tanks with drones, but to isolate the battlefield and frustrate the enemy's plans, which we are not doing. While we celebrate these inflated numbers, we are losing cities.
If the current strategy of attrition isn't working for Ukraine, Alex, what is the underlying problem?
The problem is that the Ukrainian state is destroying its own human capital. The recruitment forces, TCK, are kidnapping people on the streets, declaring war on their own people, and violating the constitution. We have a state that behaves like colonizers, exploiting its population under a false ideology of ethnic nationalism. This destroys morale. People are being fed a necrophilic cult that romanticizes death and victimhood instead of giving them a future worth living for.
I don't deny that Ukraine faces a massive manpower challenge, with desertions and draft evasion threatening to collapse the defense. Furthermore, institutional corruption is a massive strategic vulnerability that Russia exploits to destroy trust and which damages Western support. However, surrendering or making a deal under current conditions is suicide. The peace plan pushed by Trump and Putin is exactly the same as the Doha Agreement that led to the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Territory is ceded and the enemy is absolved without consulting the victim.
This is where we need to find a synthesis. Alex, you argue that Ukraine cannot win this war of attrition. Mick, you argue that peace without cost for Russia is just a pause before the next invasion. How do we structure an end to the war that accepts Ukraine's demographic reality, but ensures its survival against Russia?
We have to be realistic. We are not an independent player. Ukraine is an instrument in Western geopolitics to contain Russia and China. The only way out is to stop the war immediately and minimize the damage. If that means temporarily giving up the recovery of the Donbas to save our cities, 80% of the country and our infrastructure, we must do it. We cannot sacrifice what is left of our nation for 20% of the territory, if that means the total destruction of the state.
I can accept a territorial freeze if we acknowledge that militarily Russia cannot be expelled in the short term, but that ceasefire must be accompanied by ironclad security guarantees. The current pact proposed by the US is a joke where a Russian attack would have to be significant, deliberate and sustained to warrant a response, giving Putin every possible loophole. If Ukraine is going to cede territory, it needs needs European stabilization troops on the ground and an unwavering collective defense guarantee. Furthermore, Ukraine must maintain a strong army and continue its asymmetric innovation of missiles, ITOs, and drones to deter any future attack.
So we have two pillars: a pragmatic freezing of the front, assuming territorial losses, Arestovych's concession, backed by defense guarantees and massive rearmament, Ryan's demand. What about the internal problem you both pointed out?
The armistice is useless if the state remains rotten. We must end the brutality of the TCK and the corruption that allows elites to enrich themselves while the people die. We need to build a country open to the world, a melting pot of cultures, and abandon the ethnic monopoly that divides us.
I completely agree. Even the military reform pushed by Minister Fedorov emphasizes that without transparent management and without eradicating the bureaucratic hell and corruption in procurement, the army cannot operate. The perception of corruption erodes public morale and justifies donor cutbacks. The reconstruction of Ukraine must be conditioned on this internal cleanup.
In conclusion, the joint proposal would be territorial realism and ceasefire, acceptance of the short-term inability to recover the Donbass, freezing the conflict to save the remaining demographics and infrastructure, deterrence and security guarantees, rejection of demilitarization, inclusion of European troops on the ground and binding guarantees without loopholes, maintaining Ukrainian deep strike capabilities, internal structural reform, eradication of violent forced mobilization, TCK, purging of institutional corruption, and promotion of a civic, transparent state model to recover the population's morale. Do you agree that this would be the only viable framework to save Ukraine?
And is a bitter pill to swallow, but given the lack of Western commitment and current fatigue, it is the only way to ensure that Russia pays a price and does not try again.
That is what I have been saying. It is the only way for Ukrainians to stop being sacrificed in a war they cannot win on its current terms, and begin to rebuild a nation where people actually want to live.
Gentlemen, we have outlined a framework: territorial realism ceding the Donbass, ironclad European security guarantees on the ground, and deep internal reform in Ukraine. But a plan on paper does not stop bullets. How do we get Russia to agree to stop if Putin believes he can win a long war? And on the other hand, how do we get the Ukrainian people to accept losing territory after so much spilled blood? General Ryan, let's start with Russia.
For Putin to accept this plan, we must first recognize an uncomfortable reality. Putin does not want peace right now because he has not achieved his strategic objectives and cannot justify to his people the cost of over 1 million casualties for minimal territorial gains, nor can we rely solely on the economic pain of sanctions, because history teaches us that wars rarely end due to economic pressure alone. The only way to force Russia to accept this freeze is by making the continuation of the war militarily unsustainable. The peace plan must be preceded by a campaign of deep and relentless asymmetric strikes. We must continue supporting Ukraine so it destroys the Russian industrial base, such as the recent attack on the Kremny L microchip factory, vital for its ballistic missiles, and the systematic destruction of its maritime and railway logistics. If we combine a massive cost in Russian troops on the front lines with the destruction of their deep rear, Putin will realize that his narrative of inevitable victory is an illusion and will be forced to the negotiating table.
Mick, you still rely too much on military coercion, but the key with Russia is geopolitics. Putin is not a madman who wants to conquer all of Ukraine. He knows that is a technically and administratively impossible task to digest. He needs an exit he can sell as a victory at home. Giving him the Donbass provides that justification after 4 years of war. he will be able to tell the Russians that he saved the people's republics, which is his fundamental political objective. But the real incentive for Russia is not in Ukraine, it is in Washington. Russia has realized that its bet on the global south is not enough and yearns to reintegrate into the Western economy. In recent negotiations, the Kremlin proposed a 7-point memorandum to the United States that includes returning to dollar payments, creating joint ventures for oil and gas extraction, and lifting sanctions. That is the real implementation plan for Putin. He stops the war and keeps the Donbass, in exchange for the West returning his seat at the global economic table.
Understood. The combination of military attrition, the stick from Ryan, and Western geopolitical and economic concessions, the carrot from Arestovych, would force Russia's hand. But, Alex, what about Ukraine? You have said that the government feeds the population illusions of total victory. How do you convince Ukrainians to accept this bitter deal?
The only way is by finally telling the truth to the population and giving them back their agency as citizens. The government must stop treating them like children or slaves fed propaganda that Russians are bio-trash and we kill them by the thousands, while we lose cities. The internal implementation plan requires a real and objective referendum, where people are asked what they prefer. The real data must be put on the table. We do not have the reserves to recover the 1991 borders. In exchange for ceding 20% of the territory, we offer to stop the carnage and the tyranny of forced conscription and rebuild a truly free, efficient Ukraine open to the world. If people are given the choice between the total destruction of the state or saving the nation to rebuild it, they will accept the deal.
I agree that the Ukrainian population needs a reason to believe in this agreement, but rhetoric and referendums will not be enough if people feel they are being sold out to Russia. The Ukrainian people will only swallow this pill if the agreement includes the immediate deployment of a multinational force for Ukraine. Only if Ukrainians see NATO troops on their soil protecting the 80% of the country they retain will they feel that the loss of the Donbass was worth it to ensure the definitive survival of their free nation.
In summary, the implementation plan is based on two simultaneous pressures. For Russia, relentless military punishment on its industry and logistics, combined with an offer of global economic reintegration and the handover of the Donbass for Ukraine, a dose of internal realism validated through a national referendum, backed by the end of the state's repressive policies, and the physical and immediate deployment of European stabilization troops to ensure the war does not restart. That is a valid objection. The plan you have just formulated presupposes a strong Europe, capable of imposing the presence of European troops in the area on Putin, and also capable of relegating Donald Trump and his extravagant ideas to the background. Do you really think Europe will assume this leading role and that we will find leaders and peoples capable of agreeing to take it on?
Europe not only can assume it, but it has already begun to wake up because the survival of its security architecture depends on it. Let's look at the data. European military aid to Ukraine has increased by 67% above the average of previous years. Despite Trump's constant snubs and his unfounded complaints about NATO, Europeans have revitalized their defense industrial base. And most importantly, regarding your question about troops, in the recent Paris Declaration, European leaders agreed to form a multinational force for Ukraine, led by Europe, to provide land, air, and maritime deterrence after a ceasefire. Great Britain and France have even already signed a declaration of intent to pave the legal framework, allowing their forces to operate on Ukrainian soil in the event of a peace agreement. But regarding Trump, the reality is that his attempt to impose a 28-point Trump-Putin pact that marginalizes Europe from decisions has provoked a resounding rejection. The European Union rejected key elements of that plan, refusing to accept that borders be changed by force. Europe has the capacity. The question is whether it will maintain the political will.
Mick, you are confusing declarations of intent at press conferences with harsh realpolitik. The reality is that Europe does not want to deal with this war. It disgusts them. For European elites, sustaining Ukraine is like undergoing chemotherapy sessions. They do it reluctantly, gritting their teeth because they know the cancer of war threatens them, but they would rather not do it. Historically, Europeans have never wanted to fight with Russia or antagonize it. They want to recover the Russian market and its cheap energy resources, which were always the basis of their economic competitiveness. Furthermore, European bureaucracy is paralyzing. While the United States can move its military machinery quickly under its own laws, Europeans would take 50 years to coordinate the same logistics due to their permits and internal bureaucracy.
So, Alex, do you completely rule out that Europe can assume the role required by this peace plan?
I don't rule it out 100%, but I ask for realism. The United States still has absolute control over global maritime trade, technology, and the financial system. The real cards are held by Washington. Europe will only assume this leading role if the American abandonment is absolute, but it will do so from an initial position of weakness, trying to buy time.
And it is precisely that risk of abandonment that is accelerating the clock. It is a matter of geography. If Ukraine falls or collapses chaotically, the problem will not be in Washington. It will be on the borders of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic countries.
Is it or is it not realistic to think that this peace plan can be put into practice? And if you really believe in it, what concrete steps would you take to achieve it? Make a YouTube video, call a hunger strike at the doors of the European Parliament? Is there anyone in the real world already pushing in this direction?
It is realistic, but not because our political elite is going to have a sudden attack of good sense. The current Ukrainian ruling class feeds on war and corruption. For them, the system is a business and they are not going to change it voluntarily, not even in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe. The implementation of this plan will be imposed from the outside. The one who is already pushing relentlessly is the United States. The Trump administration is pushing its bilateral peace plan with Russia, the 28-point pact, and even discussing the possibility of a transitional government or external administration to stabilize Ukraine and force elections. As for my personal steps, I don't need to go on a hunger strike. I am already making those YouTube videos. Although the state has sanctioned me and taken away my freedom of movement, my current work, through my broadcasts and my school of thought, is the struggle for the purity of consciousness of the Ukrainian people. While the government subjects them to single-channel propaganda through the telemarathon and treats them as slaves or victims, I try to restore their ability to be subjects, masters of their destiny. My job is to show them multiple perspectives to prevent them from becoming puppets of destructive ideologies and to mentally prepare them for the harsh reality ahead.
I agree that external pressure is what will make this plan realistic, but we must be very careful with the type of plan that is imposed. As Alex rightly said, the Trump administration is applying pressure. However, their current approach looks too much like the Doha agreement that led to the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. That is not a peace plan. It is a capitulation dictated by Washington and Moscow. Fortunately, Europe is already pushing in the right direction to counter this. In the recent Paris Declaration, the European coalition of the willing, led by France and the UK, has agreed to create a European-led multinational force to provide land and air deterrence in Ukraine after a ceasefire, and they are already signing the legal declarations of intent to be able to operate on Ukrainian soil. Europe is waking up because it knows that if it yields to Trump and Putin, the war will knock on its own doors. And regarding what I do about it, my battlefield is not hunger strikes, but military doctrine and institutional influence. My job is to combat the systemic learning deficit of Western political and military institutions. I do this by publishing detailed strategic reports for CSIS and weekly analyses on my platform Futura Doctrina aimed at decision makers. I try to show them with data that forcing Ukraine to sign a peace without ironclad security guarantees will only make it easier for Russia to invade again in 1 or 10 years.
So, if I understand you both correctly, the plan is realistic because geopolitical inertia is already forcing it. The pressures already exist. The United States pushes to freeze the war for economic interests, and Europe is forced to prepare the deployment of troops to prevent that freeze from being a simple surrender. Your actions to achieve this are, from your respective trenches, a war of information and strategic education. Arestovych uses his public platforms and his school to break internal propaganda and prepare Ukrainian society for painful political realism, while General Ryan uses think tank research and analytical pressure to force Western leaders not to abandon Ukraine and to guarantee the security of the territory that is retained. This conversation has been a fictional exercise here on the Central Europa channel. The avatar Alex has sought to represent the ideas of Oleksiy Arestovych, while the avatar Mick has reflected the perspective of General Mick Ryan. We hope this dialogue has offered useful insights in the search for peace in Ukraine.